Workshop 2, session 2. I'm quickly going to share what the exercise is and tell what the groups are, right? Ta-da. Okay. So we're going all out, right? You're able to see. It's your lucky day today. You have got a very interesting proposal from the government of your choice. No political biases here right now. Full freedom. You can even go back in the past if you like the government better. So your government has invited you as a team. So you're threes or fours, remember, you're not one person. And you have been asked to build a museum together. It is a museum together. It's not the museum of your project. So please read the asterisk first. Individual will come to later. We're trying to do something first collectively as threes or fours. Money is no constraint. Land is of your choice. You want to make it on water, underwater, all your choice. What's most important is that you have to occupy 3 rooms minimum. Common areas optional, whether you think something together. And what you're thinking of is in those 3 rooms, what is happening? What are the activities then, or you need to pre-decide the activities for something to happen in those rooms? What is being displayed? So what are your archives? What are your objects? How are they being displayed? And what is the experience like, right? So we're literally making a jump. I know you're all here to talk about archives and you must be thinking, what is this mad woman talking about setting up a museum? But this exercise has usually helped a lot of us when we think about what is the tangible. And we all find it sometimes difficult. So while for Radhika, it was easier when it's an institutional project, but the struggle when you're thinking about family projects and to look for these things, it sometimes helps to extend it and imagine that you're actually displaying it. So moving from access in terms of frameworks or record management in an archive to access as an exhibition or a exhibited space. So when you think of it, you'll be able to push and imagine what kind of objects or what do you need to do to the objects that you have. Let it raise more questions. The intention is not to have a resolved museum in the end of 45 minutes. It's more to raise questions in terms of what is it that you need to do. If there was a museum or half a museum of Garba spaces in Gujarat or in Baroda particularly, or if there was a museum about history or culture of wetlands, what needs to be told and shown? You can decide your user group. You can decide whether it's the same across the friends, partners or not. It can be different ones also. Okay. So all that is what is not said here is your freedom. Okay, groups. Tanika, Tonisha, and Sharon. Second group is Soni, Debankita, and Yamini. Reema, Shwetal, and Nijum. Beena, Aparna, Shinidhi, and Kaustav. Aparna's link. And in the meanwhile, the plan is to use these 45 minutes that we're going to have to listen to each group, but which also means during that, if participants can very briefly introduce their own projects through materials also. So earlier, when you gave your introductions, it was more it was more descriptive. Right now, at least in the physical space, we do have 2 people who've got their collection. Shwetal, if you want to show something on the screen. So while we're doing a group presentation, we can also use this time for participants to show what they are working with. So actual stuff. Deepthi and Radhika are also here. In the meanwhile, if anybody has questions and want to start talking or discussing with them. This is more for Yamini and Tonisha. Over here, people have spoken with them. So Tonisha, Yamini, if you have any questions for Deepthi or Radhika, we could start with those while we're waiting. No pressure.
Yamini?
Yes, go ahead.
Would you
Yes,
like to
we
go
can.
first?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your work. Honestly, especially because it is so personal and you have put in such thought and effort in it. I come from a small town and my focus has been talking about the small histories or the little histories or the things that don't always make space within mainstream representations of things. So it was, academically speaking, it was very good to be a part of that presentation. But personally speaking, we I think all of us in humanities and also the sciences, I'm hoping, we work on things we care about, and there is always this sort of a background logic of social justice that often informs our works in different ways. But the moment we start talking about it, we are immediately told to distance ourselves from our subjects a bit, right? That's step one of academic research, whether it's cultural studies like mine is, or design or history, discipline specifically going into it. So, speaking, I'm still reeling from my father's death. And even as I want to not keep losing bits and pieces of his memories, I am terrified of the very prospect of going and actually looking for them. So, to both of you, since family histories and family stories are a core part of both your works in different ways, how have you managed to balance that space, that distance between you? Both of you mentioned that in your presentations, of course, but could you, if you could bring in a few more thoughts on that, because personal grief, it's, as I think one of you mentioned, it is traumatic at times to honestly go and open that box. So, hi, is that Agastya?
Yes, that
So,
is like
okay, hi, Agastya. So, how do you cope with the fact of loss or grief when handling something like this? Could you share your thoughts, whatever you're comfortable sharing? A
Hi,
little
Tanisha.
more.
Um, how did I handle it? I did not. I did not handle it. I was speaking to Srinidhi just now during lunch break, and I was telling him how every day I went to that room, basically our library in our house, where I dumped everything related to my father-in-law, and I kept it there to begin to work on. That was like my workspace. But when I went there, I froze. Every morning, I just froze. He was like the dearest person, I mean, in my adult life that I met and loved so dearly. So it was very, very painful, but I did not handle it. And I gave myself time. I mean, I'm sure Sita will throw deadlines at you saying 10th October, 12th October. You can, you can take, Agastya, give me a minute. Give me a minute. You should totally, especially if you're going to do something um, as personal as this, you should take your time to grieve the way you can and you want to, because this will come at a space. The how you want to represent that will come at a space when you're really at peace with it, for the lack of a better word. So I did not handle it, and yeah, I mean, you'll find the time and space, and you should totally give it that.
Thank you. Also, it's uh, Deepthi.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was Deepthi, right?
Yes, I
Um,
don't know where to
and
look. Okay.
I am sorry. I know it's
Okay.
very. We can also see a sort of
Yeah.
pixelated simulation
Yeah.
like screen there. But also, and again, this goes to both of you, both for both your presentations. I think there is somebody else in that room who's talking about their grandfather's trunk. I'm so sorry I couldn't get
That's
your
Srini.
name because of the, yes, Srinidhi. And a lot of us don't always have very fond memories of our families. Or uh, I know that I have a very complex love-hate relationship with the memories of my grandparents, given how they treated my parents, or the kind of expectations that one has about patriarchal familial norms, whatever you call it. So when one loves and one in one sense idolizes, it's both painful and rewarding in one way. But when it is a slightly more difficult relationship, and I think there are people like me or Srinidhi and other people out there who would sometimes just not vouch for it when going into family histories. uh, what are the complexities of that? Because am I villainizing them if I'm trying to put down an object or a story or a narrative down and say that this is how I remember my family, or this is what my family archive looks like, or something very personal is being represented here? Or am I at least managing that kind of a space where I can say that, okay, this is the life and these were the contexts, but this is going on right now. We can't ignore that they responded in this way. So, Srinidhi, perhaps you would also want to add to this?
I'll say something.
Uh-huh.
Before I lose the thought, sorry. Um, this is why when we go through the rigor of going through an archiving course as like this one, this is when we have to remind ourselves. Otherwise, we're just writing our personal narratives. But when we put ourselves in the shoes of an archivist, you wake up objectively in the morning. 10 days, I may cry going to the room, but the 11th day, I'm going to wake up and say, wait a minute, I have a deadline. I'm an archivist. What is the story that I want to tell? And who is going to, you know, listen to this story, look at this story, touch this story? So who is my audience? I will bring back what my mentor told me, Sarita Sundar. She reminded me constantly that, put your, because this has to have a closure somewhere. It is a project. It's not like life that goes on. So she really said, wake up in the morning, think of your audience, and then you'll know what story you want to say and what story. Like, for all the love that I have for my father-in-law, I have to be so mad at him because I don't see anything of my mother-in-law being acknowledged in his life. But and I know from the age of 17, she has done everything, living her life for him and for her children. So I said, where is it? She was a presidential award winner for Carnatic music. I don't have a single recording in the house of a scientist who had like the most expensive gadgets from Japan and you're in there, but there's not a single recording of this young person who was so immensely talented. I'm mad at him. But do I want to tell the story? And now at this age. So who is my audience? What do I want to represent of the person who I'm archiving, or of whoever institution, whatever I'm archiving? Who does my audience need to know the story? I may be mad, but does that mad have to be translated into something that my audience need to know, and at this age? So that really worked for me, to sieve out what I want to and what I don't want to tell, because that was a very difficult dilemma. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We can't hear anything.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So I really, really related to what you just said, because I also lost my father young and I haven't touched with his archives. In my grandfather's archive, the only way I get to know him is like what I get to know, because I never was in touch with him. But so the archive is everything of my grandfather with me. But my father's, I can't. My mom is, and in therapy I worked on this, and I have anxious, I have avoidant attachment, so I put it all in a cupboard and kept away for one day to be open, and that is fine. And yeah, but with my grandfather, I'm getting to know him through these archives. So it can be very traumatic to open a freshly happened wound, and mine has been about 10 years and I still can't open it. And I think that's fine. But one day you will. And that I did have, once I opened it, and then I found this 80s era phone book in my father's collection. And I was like, okay, so how did he deal with this? And then that was such a different thing that I found there, because I could find a glimmer of his youth, something that in a traditional upbringing family I'd never find in terms of sexual liberation. And as a queer person, for me, it was all liberating to find that book. So that I'm reading. So yeah, I think once in a while you can dabble with it and come out, but it is very difficult, and that's fine. But I'm really liking this conversation. It's very therapeutic. I don't know when I'll break down, but thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm sorry. But yes, it's helping, I think.
Sorry. Yes, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes. Nana, Ishita,
So what
we
Deepti was
haven't.
saying, which was not on the mic, is that we used to reflect like this on CPA 2020 every now and then when we said these are more therapeutic spaces than actually professional spaces. And I think that's a bigger achievement, perhaps, is how I feel at least about it. So you don't need to say sorry, Tonisha. That's what I'm coming to. It's completely okay to ask these questions. One more project which I would want you to look at from the last edition is Avantika's work, where she's actually talking about dealing with grandfather's trauma, you and Srinidhi. So I'll share these links which are coming to my mind, time it for you so you can actually look for those projects and read up. But again, I can put you in touch with her and you all can grow these projects further. Do you want to add, Radhika, anything?
Uh, so the kind of project I'm looking at is not very people centered. I think it's more structure centered, but people do become a very important part of it. Like how I was discussing with Ishita, because it's a factory and it was something that was made during the colonial period, there might have been a lot of exploitation that was involved. Definitely, there was a lot of caste issues that might actually come up. But as of now, as uh, you engage with the archival material that you have. uh, okay, you take your time to deal with it, and you have to take, as Deepti mentioned, as much time as you can, and then if you want to, you have to definitely go back to the material because it has something to offer. And people in the past, of course, they influence you, but they cannot be changed. So it has to be dealt with how it is. Um, I have not yet come across that situation, but yeah, it is something that we might have to deal with when it comes.
I think I would also want to just put one more point. It's not only when you will be dealing with your family history that it will come up. And I am a living proof of that because have too much that I could have documented and I have nothing right now. So all these projects are becoming, in the day, they're becoming a way to feel good about, but in the night, they're not. So there will be other avenues once you step into the space of caring for history and preserving for histories of different kinds. So I'm referring to, let's say, Sundarban project or the Bankita working with the Hyderabad Heritage. It can still trigger memories and conversations about your family and about your past.
Yeah.
So what also happens is sort of this by-lane archiving that you might get into. So I know a lot of family members who are now digging out things and sending it to me. I don't know if I'll be able to make sense because it's not an guided process or a directed process. It's just that they're responding to my work. So those experiences can also then they sometimes make you a bit helpless also because you wouldn't have pieces to put together. So that's also a possibility. Start with the group presentations and perhaps bring these points and conversations into it, if that's okay. So, Tonisha, Tanika, and Sharon, if you guys could go first, tell us, and then we'll move on to group 2 and 3.
So very briefly, we decided to make a museum on the Royal Bengal tiger. So the museum is ideally located on these three artificial man-made islets on any water body. I mean, we typically thought at the center of a public park because especially there are people from Bangalore sitting there, right? So a man-made lake or bit of river that has a park around it, something where children, families go to. So in a space like that, constructing three individual tiny islets that are connected with a log and rope bridge. And there are canoes available for those not of the faint-hearted. So, and each islet taking up one part of the narration. So, uh, we are a little conflicted about the name because we want the title to be in English. But as you may have realized, this is taking up the tone of an amusement park or a horror story walkthrough theme sort of a situation. So there are three the 3 sections are titled Introduction to the Sundarbans, that is recreated or as immersive an experience as possible. So mangroves with their roots visible, trees, plants, bees, crocodiles, snakes, the tiger, the honey collector, so giving a sense of the natural habitat of the tiger and the ways in which indirectly we also want to talk about the people who are the tiger's neighbors in these regions. The second room is stories about the Royal Bengal tiger, and the third room is on the conversations about conservation and ecology. So this is what we broadly have. Tanika, Sharon, would you take up from here? I can also share the PPT that I had presented for a very different conversation in a conference to give you some of the stories or illustrations on the Royal Bengal tiger that I used. So,
So
yes,
could I
Sharon,
suggest that Tanika and Sharon, if you can spring from this and tell us about your projects, how they would fit here. And then we'll go back to
yes,
seeing the Sundarban presentation. So that would be a nice way to
sure,
close this.
yes,
So I think we kind of picked this because it linked children's literature, which was something Sharon was interested in, and for me also generally like people's relationship with nature. So we particularly the part about the stories. So we were talking about how like usually like predators are depicted as villains, but we don't want to portray only that narrative. So find stories of different kinds. So like anything that we can find. So poetry or films or comic strips or anything that people have written or people have orally recorded anything about their relationship with the tiger. So Tonisha was sharing how some of the stories that she found through her research were like some of them depicted the tiger as a baby and some as the tiger as some kind of a hero. And a lot of them were horror stories of people getting like, victims of like tiger hunts and things like that. So I think that's how it relates to mine. So looking at how different people relate to this tiger. Yeah.
Very interesting way of putting it. Sharon, do you want to pitch it?
No, actually, so yeah, like Tanika mentioned that it's as I also work with stories and things. Like right now, I'm working with it. So we were trying to come up with stuff around that. So there was one I mean, while we were having this conversation, we had brought up how we can make this a little more, student friendly. So it's, yeah, just that. Nothing else to add.
Thank you. I think, yeah, that would be a nice thing to add here, who it was for. So students and hence the kind of stories that would be told. But I'm also going to highlight, so everybody's been asking me purpose of this exercise. So at least in this one, for example, when we listen to group one, I think the next question which would come up if you were building this museum is to how will you go about collecting these stories and how will you record them? And it also comes back to certain questions that Tonisha and we all were talking last time would be the ethics of story collection in certain places. So the exercise was meant to sort of help you think of tools that you would require to collect your archival material. If you were going to look for it now, if you already had archival material, then we would have talked about how will you present them. Hopefully when we come to this group, when you are looking at physical archives. So any conversation that three of you had around how will you go around collecting these stories or how will you represent these stories? Any of you thought about or argued about that?
I think as for the collections, since like Tonisha has worked on something like this, she's already collected a lot of stories. So she was sharing how she had done that. So Tonisha, do you want to just share that?
Yes, I think that's time to
Like there was some like poems that like there was one poem that she translated and things like that. So yeah.
I'll stop sharing, Tanisha. Over to you.
So before we begin, though Bengal is not a homogeneous space, right? So a lot of the Bengali culture industry is centered around Kolkata. So it has a sort of monopoly over narratives and especially what we consider cultural texts, music, films, novels, everything that comes out. So, and there is, of course, a gap, especially when you look at marginalized peripheral spaces like Sundarbans, which are only looked at through this mainstream gaze, the local stories or indigenous narratives, or how does a community, villager, children, students who live right next to a forest that has a tiger in it, how are they looking at their lived situation? That doesn't get to be in the mainstream a lot. So if you will see that, that's why I have the PPT is called Bhadralok, because when I say Bhadralok, I mean this very mainstream Kolkata centric way of looking at a space, or the tiger in this case. Right. I will share the PPT now. Okay. So as I said, this is for a very different conference where I was talking about politics of representation. And I said that there is the objective reality of the tiger. There is something like, let's say, the dictionary entry or the kind of photos you can Google from sites like National Geographic. But if you didn't have access to this kind of material, if you had to look at fiction and stories and therefore figure out how or what a tiger is, how would you go about that? It's a bit like, it's deliberately a little like the blind people figuring out what an elephant is. By putting blinders on. So one part of talking about the Royal Bengal tiger and Sundarbans is, of course, talking about Bon Bibi, the local goddess, and how closely linked she is to the forest and therefore also the tiger. So Bon Bibi is somebody Hindus, Muslims, irrespective of religious affiliations and beliefs, worship, because she is supposed to keep honey collectors, loggers, fishermen safe when they are going in the woods. This is a very old poem by Rabindranath Tagore. A lot of people forget how, for the lack of a better word, bitchy and sarcastic Tagore is. So I translated it. It is still taught in India in Bengali textbooks. It's one of the things you read when you're in class 2 and 3. And you can just take a couple minutes to read it. I have 2 other images to show, so we are good in time. So in this particular paper presentation, I was looking at the different ways in which mainstream children's, young adults, but also adult narratives use the tiger. Because there is, of course, the tiger is a specter that keeps haunting literatures from these sites. It's a lived reality. The fact of living right next to the tiger, or when human rights need to be suspended for wildlife rights, these are very contested sites of conversation, right? So I looked at literary sources where the tiger has, of course, been anthropomorphized, personified, treated as a villain, treated as somebody who can be fooled, treated as the baby. So, for instance, local narratives, the little bits of them that we start getting, you have stories like this where a drunk father-in-law thinks that the tiger is the calf that he's supposed to bring back from the grazing fields, and manages to basically get hold of the tiger cub and put it in the cowshed. Or the fact of, if somebody was a forest ranger and they took care of a tiger cub, years later, the tiger now grown, still recognizes them and just cuddles them, essentially. So the distance from the Sundarbans, the distance between Sundarbans and Kolkata, and how the narratives keep shifting or changing from this very exoticized or otherized way of looking at the tiger as this monster, as this wild thing, that. And on the basis of that, as you can see with this image as well, it's very normal within the story, and this is a biographical account, so it's very normal for the people living there still, that yes, the tiger is a hunter. There are preys, there are tiger widow colonies in the Sundarbans areas. There is no underwriting that. But if you're living next to something like this day in, day out, the exoticizing factor also goes down. So it is very normal to take out a fire stick from your oven, from your clay oven, your chula, and chase a tiger which is trying to do something. So these are, while the illustrations are may look comical, they are based on real people and their lives, right? So, and that is why I titled the paper Uncanny Valley, that how far or how familiar is the image of the tiger? How are you thinking about it, feeling about it? So yes, that was the kind of work I was doing there. If you need a couple minutes to read this quotation, please take your time.
Okay. So thank you, Tunisha. Thank you so much. And I think one of the things I'm going to highlight with your presentation is exactly why we need to understand for ourselves the difference between archiving, interpretation, curation, storytelling. This is something, again, I was talking to a few participants here in the morning while we were warming up, that we need to understand for ourselves. I don't think these are definitions which one is looking for. And what I mean over here is what Tonisha, your presentation highlighted, that here's what the original story or the poem would have meant, and here is what the illustration does, and here is what maybe the new story could have become. There will also be that becoming of stories. So, as an archivist, without getting too much caught up into questions of authenticity, how many layers of history can you sort of first showcase or project for a world to engage with? So even in terms of Garba, for that matter of fact, yes, it must have modified itself, but still there is a version of 2019 or 2000 or 1990s is as much important to document and talk about for what it is, right? So this distinction between why are we right now talking archiving, and then we will move into curation of stories. So this is how I'm going to right now leave this presentation. Um, Coming to the next group, Shwetal, Nijum, and whom am I missing? Rima.
Okay. So Nijum, I hope you'll join in at some point. Okay. So all three of us were a little confused initially when we started out on this. We took some time to think about who are we trying to build this museum for? Who is the one who is going to use this archival material? And all three of us had very different target audiences for our individual research, and we were trying to make something which worked for all three of us. So we did have some physical ideas in mind. For me, I was very clear that I want the first person to be who's experiencing is the person who's also contributing to the information, which is it's a living culture. It is not something. It's not only history. It's history which keeps getting regurgitated every year in different ways. So uh, it's very difficult to kind of hold it into a strict archival form. And I also need that participation from the person who's viewing. For Nijum, she felt that the work that she's doing with this particular artist is a resource place for the art community, artists and people who are interested in arts, and for further research for people in Bangladesh, and to further the cause of art in Bangladesh. Nijum, have I got it right?
Yes.
Yeah. And for Rima, though she was working on thugs and the history of those people, she felt that she was more inclined to looking at films which depicted this right, wrong, good, bad, whatever. And she felt that she wanted to create a space for basically different kind of films, videos, all that kind of material. So now coming to what we wanted to showcase, so we had a form kind of like I was sitting and drawing something, and so we had these four circles that kind of came together, and so one circle for each person's work, and one circle which would be an interactive space, and a little space in the center which, as we were talking about ADHD, and that zoning out time with museums and archives and all can be very overwhelming for a lot of people. And I personally find it, I don't like museums. I can look at a work of art standalone, but museums can drive me nuts. And I was very glad that I found somebody who felt the same way. So, yes, looking into that as something which has to be not too heavy on the person who comes to interact with that space. So, for Garba, especially, I felt that yes, it could actually be a place where a person can come and access for doing workshops. So every year, like in the last workshop that we had, somebody suggested to me that I connect with people who do Garba workshops before Navratri. And I felt that was an amazing place to have to make an influence, because I feel that my archival work or whatever work I'm doing should actually impact the festival and not just be something that's holding history together. So I felt that creating that kind of a place where a person can, access some Garba, also come in, given some material. And as you said, of course, the whole challenge, curate that information, but also contribute continuously over there. Also, maybe a cathartic space, because I feel that this whole festival is about women, and we talk about women and Nari Shakti, and I keep getting asked like, "Have you talked about Nari Shakti?" But I feel that the biggest thing about this festival is the cathartic experience, the letting go of your identity. Though you're all dressed in all finery and you're feeling very womanly and all, there are moments when you completely forget who you are. And I think that space, so some way create that atmosphere, even which, so when a person walks in, they get that feeling for a while. How we'll create, I don't know. But as we were allowed to imagine. So
No, but that's actually very important. So we
Yeah.
don't see the reason why we wanted you to think of experiences and you have done is wonderful, because then it allows us to see the material for more than what it is.
Yeah.
So now already putting so this is the group, by the way, who had very dissimilar projects together out of the three. And when you are trying to put them together, trying to see experience or giving the viewer a me time or a time to imbibe, and that being the reason for the projects to come together, it's automatically meaning that now when you will start to look at, let's say, the curation or the archival sheets or cataloging, you will be able to see the material with 5 more lenses or 2 more lenses.
Correct.
So this is the reason, one of the other reasons why this exercise was important, to stretch it and see what more does Garba become, as you are rightly describing, and Nijum might see something for the artwork.
Yeah. So maybe Nijum can talk about her, because she had some
Different,
different things. Only one more. I also thought of maybe having a part of the museum which is virtual for all of us. We were thinking, and also having a part of it which is actually a physical, like a mobile thing, which actually can go visit places, and it can reach people who will be inhibited in walking into spaces. So
definitely, yes. Nijum, do you want to add to this? How would this kind of an experience work in terms of your project? Or would it not? And you might do something different in the same space.
For me, I think I think for a museum, contemporary art museum, in this exercise, I think this as a museum, and uh, I I need to collect this material, and there is a huge background part to execute these things, because I think I this backup. I need this backup, and um, yeah, it's okay to collect their all the materials. This is my main concern, is all these materials and combine together and execute this. And I don't think that this is can be a fixed museum. Then I can travel this with this museum and show different areas. And this placement, I want to think work for this, like a museum with the travel, and I can work in the education space. Then young generation artists can take their knowledge from from the history in 90s. So at the yeah, it's okay for me that what Shetal tell me about my project.
Thank you, Nijum. And I'm just going to translate a little bit of what you just said for everyone else to also extend it into their projects. So one of the things which Nijum is highlighting right now is putting together of different objects. So even though she's looking at two artists who are a couple or a partnership, it's a good question to ask. How do you put it all together, right? So not just in the collective realm, which was just an exercise. You might actually get a grant to do your own project. But even then, when you will start seeing disparate objects, and I think very similar to again what Deepthi said, it will be important to see it. They are for themselves what they are: photographs, documents, films. But what your user, any kind of a user, whether it's an archive user or a museum user, is looking for is a way to connect or make connections. So while a curator tells stories and exhibits, archivist doesn't really unload themselves or unleash that responsibility. And that is why narrative building as much becomes a part of archive building process as much as maybe a curatorial process. What will again be the difference? We will talk in the following workshops about this. The second thing I think both of you reflected on is types of museum or types of archive. So keep looking at every time I say museum archive in the mirror. They can be physical, they should be digital in today's day and age, so nobody is deprived of information. But could it also be a more living or a traveling archive, right? So that there is access to more people and more communities. But the key question in that case, unlike an exhibition, which is traveling and I am supposed to usually absorb as a user, in an archive, there is a possibility of more engagement. So when you are thinking traveling, whether you are traveling to collect your archive or archive is traveling with you, are there more activities that can emerge out of it so that archives don't become again this box which is locked away for years in a certain family or in a certain institution or in a certain group? So these are good takeaways for other projects also to think about. Do you want to add?
Like for Nijum's thing, one of the things that I was excited about is that because like my thing, hers is also a living archival project. The artist is around, the artist is there to participate. And like I felt that, if there could be internships, if there could be live workshops that the artist could conduct within maybe not one space, but many spaces, it can become part of the larger, because then there is a different way that you're again making the main subject interact with the audience, and I hope we can do, because I want to do it.
In fact, this takes me back to the conversation we had in September, where you can still think of this as a community-based archive. So not just community benefiting from you doing something, but they becoming a part of the archive building process. Because what you're doing here is a prototype. When you actually execute it after a grant or something, say February onwards, you actually get 3 or 4 participants from the community who work along with you, and they become your RAs and archivists. That would be the ideal situation. Then your worries of authorship and ethics are also really taken care of to a great extent. Okay, so coming to the third group, keeping in mind that the fourth group you haven't been able to meet, right? So I'm just going to put a message for you all in the chat. But in the meanwhile, third group is Dina, Aparna, Kostov was not able to join you guys, and Shinidhi. So over to you guys. And we have 12 minutes for you guys.
Okay, so
Do we
our
begin?
group actually a little bit takes off on what BP was saying. We were actually more focused on the space which we like to term a museum. Okay, so we were focused on the fact that it's not our space, it is other space. And we are actually, invading their space. Let's not be arrogant and elitists and think about their dress and who they are, and come in and hold champagne glasses and, act a certain way inside a museum which is created by us. This is them, this is their space. So we were thinking also in terms of moving out, maybe having installation boxes or video or audio recorders in bus stops, in the backs of auto rickshaws, so that we get people from every walk of life, maybe the auto rickshaws granddaughter who has never really been exposed or given an outlet. for what her idea of what her grandmother may have thought of, or maybe some letter that we interpret a certain way, but maybe a Gen Z generation person living in rural Puttur will have a very different take on what we want to present in a museum. So we were not thinking of one physical space, we were thinking of outside, okay, including people. And one important point that Srinidhi brought up, which people really don't think about, is make it inclusive to people with all kinds of disabilities, visible disabilities, invisible disabilities, all kinds of gender. That is really irrelevant. One quick point that I think came out is like, who is the audience? Let's not, caricature everyone into this is the audience and this is what they're going to be and this is what they should be reacting. No, the audience is who they think they are. So briefly, that's what we were thinking of. Not a physical space, but a them space.
Yeah.
So just to quickly, sorry, Srinidhi,
Go ahead, please go
carry
ahead.
on. I'll go after Srinidhi. Were you saying something?
Okay, so basically, we were thinking because all of us have material archives that are quite not represented in museums. So we were kind of looking at a museum of material artifacts, but in the context of undocumented histories as well. So ma'am suggested a very nice idea of as soon as you enter the museum or you're out. Yeah, so we were looking at a kind of museum of material objects, but in the context of oral histories as well. So ma'am suggested that we'll have a ton of mics when you enter in and you have closed safe spaces. Maybe we'll anonymize the sharings that you're doing, but it also includes the museum visitor as well, because more often than not, when you have this glass wall and you have these curatorial notes, most people don't read it. But the moment you have some activity there, which could even be as simple as a selfie, people are interested in it. So you're in front of the Mona Lisa, you want to take a selfie. Instead, let's say we are having a history of saris. So we're looking at history of fabrics and saris. You can now touch and feel, and now you're going through how it has actually had quite a gender agnostic history. Like Tirupati Balaji is made to wear a sari every day even now. So and then you kind of go through how gendering of sari as a thing has happened. And today in the queer context, if a non-binary person or a trans person wears a sari, or even a cis man wears a sari, it is laughed at. But then by the time you kind of unlearn these patterns through history of sari through the museum, in the end you have this selfie stand where you now, there is this mannequin kind of standee behind which you can stand, and you're going to don a sari and how you're going to look even as a cis man. And probably you look good. And you'd want to share those selfies with other people, and that becomes more of an interactive thing. And also, maybe later you like it and you want to take a printout of it or something, or print it on a coffee mug, those could be chargeable. And that could be a way of revenue making for the museum. But then we kind of realized this still creates a very exclusive space that even if it is free of cost, not everybody would have access to come there and access it and so on. So we'll take it out and we will be using more relatable stuff like street theater and kiosks that are more or just your phones, and then you go to non-elite audiences, and then you'll be able to get far more representation and access using the travel.
Yeah. So I just like to interject here. This is Aparna. Just can you all hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, the insight we wanted to use here was the fact that sometimes museums tend to have a sort of an elite tag, and we wanted to make it more exclusive. Also, the concept of curating content, of crowdsourcing content, and being co-creators or co-curators in the process. So we thought of using, along with live material memory, there could be material objects. We could also use QR codes, which then connect to the world outside. And anyone who wants to pitch in with their contribution to what the exhibit is or their memory can do so seamlessly by using the QR code that can link to a site. And similarly, that QR code can also feature in certain public spaces, so that everything comes together in an integrated manner. These are some of the ideas we discussed.
Great. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for opening up very new points. So it's very nice. Each group had very different kind of concerns. I think when we talk about making a space for them, I think that's itself very powerful. And now I'm going to see both of these points, right? So whether we talk about making space for them in terms of abilities, or the last point that Aparna made, which is about QR code. What will be important is to keep in mind how vast can your framework be for you to handle. So now when the ideas become very aspirational, I will always have to sort of caution you and say you're a one-person team or maximum or a two or a three people team. So how expansive can your framework be? And this is not to say you can't. We know of projects which have used a lot of digital tools to be able to do very well crowdsourced projects. But somewhere can it emerge from first your understanding of your archive? And in your case, because there was a very strong similarity between all three projects in terms of family history, material, but your stories are very different, right? So what happens if you were putting it together? Ideally, right now you're going to make your own archives beyond this point. First, what are the key aspects that you would work with? Here, I'm going to sort of elucidate also an example which I should have given with Nijum's project, the contemporary art archive itself, for example, from being just specifications of art medium, like medium, material, size, or even architectural archive. That itself, when it tries to grow into a either a personal space or an emotional or an intangible space, we find it very difficult to work with. Trying it, but honestly, it is getting difficult. So now on this side, when you work with family histories, and you will move from the intangible mapping to the tangible, you will have to tell the tangible. How big is the coin? How big, small is the book? Which language is it published in? Because that's how your users are going to come to you. How long can your Excel sheet become? Right? It's an Excel sheet mapping. So when you think crowdfunding, it will still have to be rooted in your way of looking at family history. And if somebody else has a different way of looking at it, that might be project two. So let's not mix up lens or the framework of building archives to expansiveness. So that's one of the words of caution. Yes, definitely for them. And that is the other way to put it when it comes to health issues or it comes to sexuality. This is now a personal take which I'm sharing. I think I've shared it in the last session also. Is it fair for those who don't understand another gender or another community or another person's blues to archive for them? Right? So, should that much of leeway be given when we open up? When you are putting this out there, you associate with a certain gender or a certain health situation, fine. So, when we open up the archives, any form of archival practice in terms of expansiveness, giving the power to the audience is important, but not abuse of power. And that is what we are seeing, sorry, but on social media right now in terms of how information is being interpreted and smashed around. So we'll have to be a little careful there. We want to aspire for it, but got to be conscious of it. Drawing a dotted boundary, not a closed boundary, but not a completely open, fluid boundary as well. So that's my comment to this last group for now. Anybody else wants to tell anything to each other? 3 minutes. Our presenters are already on screen, I know. So anybody wants to remark on what I said, disagree with it? That's also.
One point I like to bring up is the word vernacular. We're all talking in English, but yeah, let's also start focusing on the vernacular system of museums or archive keeping. India is a land of more than 1,500 languages and dialects. So let us start thinking about other languages.
And this is something which we will literally tap into the moment we move to the next workshop in November, where we are getting into information management. So while the exercise will be for us to actually draw out a tree structure and imagine, automatically with this variety that we have in the room, we will be talking about what will I call this? Because you have Gujarat, you have Sundarbans, I think you have Hyderabad, you have Deccani region. So yeah, Tulu. So we are going to face that immediately that, okay, now this description of my archival object, which metadata field will it go into? And that is the first immediate, sort of tryst with language we face when we start archiving. So yes, we will be talking about, again, how much can we work with bilingual material? How much do we leave it to the AI or the machine to help us? Again, and bring it. So the cycle goes on. Who is your user audience? How much should they do? How much should we do? Do we leave it to public engagement when we bring in the second language and maybe make the archive only in English, so on and so forth? So we'll come to that definitely. Language is a very critical part, generally for archiving, more so for us in the country. And then dialects of language, the moment we say language. Anybody else? Yes, Tonisha, please.
You
1
know,
minute to go.
yes. Two things very quickly. One is that we are very suspicious of this assumption of raw data, right? We don't, from at least my disciplinary stance, we don't believe that there is an objective reality out there that is then represented through something. Any representation has its own inflections automatically, always, already. And we don't know if there is anything else objectively speaking out there. The second thing is, the moment we are talking about archiving and museums, the moment it's museums, people immediately assume it has a pedagogical function as opposed to archives. That's one thing. And the third is, when we are talking about things like, I'm so glad Srinidhi pointed that out. When I'm talking about Sundarbans, because it is a conversation about wildlife and spaces, people would assume that we don't have to worry about it being a queer inclusive space. So having feminist queer spaces which allow for, let's say, a Dalit queer woman or boy or girl from the Sundarbans area to also be a part of the narrative, because, how to make that happen, how to work with that is a core concern. Thank you. I think I made the minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Tonisha. And I'm glad that you closed with that point where museums are thought to be academic spaces and archives are not. That's enough for the exercise itself done correctly.